Okay, so now that we have access to the authenticated user data, we now want to have a global state management tool. So what we will be using is React Redux along with Redux Toolkit. So if we go on to redux-toolkit.ds.org/tutorials of TypeScript, we will be installing and going through this to set up everything that we need in our application. First of all, we need to install the Redux Toolkit. So it will be yarn add React Redux along with Redux and also at Redux/toolkit. So if we press enter, this will then install everything that we need. So everything has been installed. So all we need to do is yarn run dev once again, press enter. And as we do with all external libraries, we need to create a new folder within our lib folder. So this one will be called store, like so. So this is our Redux store that we are creating. And in here, I'm going to create an index.ts. This is where all our store will be handled. So now what we need to do is set up the store. So if we scroll down, we need to define root state and dispatch types as we are using TypeScript. So if we copy this across and paste it in to our index.ts, what it also is doing is configuring the store with certain reducer information. So in our case, we will have users, which is correct. So I'm going to delete these ones and I'm going to name this user reducer. So if I just take out the S, so it will just be user reducer and also single user. And in here, I'm going to create a new function called reducers. Then now we have defined the user reducer, we now need to define the reducer itself. So in store, I'm going to create a new folder named reducers, because what we will do is we will also have a basket reducer as well. And in here, I'm going to create a new file named user reducer.ts, like so. And now all I need to do is import that. So it will be import user reducer from /reducers/user reducer, like so. So now what we need to do is we need to create a user reducer now. So if we scroll down, it also says to define some hooks. So that will be handy for when we are using the dispatch type and use app selector. So we essentially are giving types to the use dispatch hook and the use selector hook. So let's copy this across as well. So in store, create a new folder in here, and this will be named hooks. And in hooks, we are going to have index.ts, and then we're just going to paste in what we have here. Then now we are also going to import the root state and app dispatch, but not from store this time. We have named it as index, so it will be up a level to /store, like so. And now if I save, it's saying cannot find module of store, so it will be /index, like so, and now save. So essentially we have configured two steps, which is define typed hooks and define root state and dispatch types. So if we scroll down further, it says define slice state and action types. So now what we need to do is define the user reducer state and its types of actions. So what we can do is copy this, and in our user reducer now, we can paste in the code that we have from the example over here. So if we break it down, initially we have a initial state, as you can see here, and that is a value. What we need to do is change this around, so it will be the user state. So we need to change the counter to user, like so, and then the user state will have a user in here, and initially the user will be null. So as you saw before, the user was an object that we was console logging. So in here, if we inspect in our console, type in test at test.com, and then the password is 123456. If I press sign in, as you can see, it says no user found. So we now need to create your Amazon account. So if I click that and we close this down, it's just saying that we have reused the same password twice. We have this user object, so this will be a type. So we need to define that type. Initially, the interface for user state will be null. So user initially will either be null, like so, or it's going to be this object type. So what we will do is the pipe, like so, and then we can have access to the Firebase user. So Firebase user And if we take that out, and all we do is control space. If it's not importing, we just need to find it. So if I copy this and paste it in as an import, so essentially we are importing the user as Firebase user from Firebase/auth. So that is the user state or the user type defined. So I'm just going to name this user type like so, and then capitalize this. And all we need to do is do the same here. So essentially what we have done is define the type for the slice state or the user state, and then we will define the initial state using that type. So initially when we log into our application, the user is going to be null because we haven't filled in the login form and we haven't authenticated with Firebase authentication. So that's why it will be null for now. Going back into our application, now we have the slice. So essentially this is the slice that has all of our actions in. So what we want to do is essentially have two actions, and they will be, instead of increment, they will be sign into account, which is one action that we have, and then the other action is going to be sign out from account, which is another action that we need to create. So when we log in, we can either log in or log out, and these will be actions that we will call to update the global state of our application. So we update this user here, so it will either be null or it will be this object that we have here. So the name of this slice is going to be the user, and instead of counter slice, we are going to call this the user slice. So this is the user slice part of the Redux store. So essentially this will handle all of the user information, the actions, and whether we want to fetch the user state. So for example, if we wanted to fetch the user email, we can then use the use selector, or in this case, the use app selector in our hooks. Going back into the user reducer here, we now have set up the type. We now need to set up the user slice, and then we also need to export the actions. So instead of counter slice now, it will be user slice dot actions like so. And then the two actions we are going to create is the sign into account. So sign into account, and then the other one is the sign out from account. So if I copy this and paste this in also. So now, as you can see, these actions are readily available. If I import them into a component, I can then either call sign into account or sign out from account. Okay, so the first action we're going to amend is sign out from account, which takes in a piece of state. So when we call the sign out from account, what essentially we want to do is get access to the state.user, which is this here, this state over here, and we essentially want to just set it to null, so is equal to null. That's a nice simple one. There are no parameters or actions we need to pass in to sign out from account, so this one will be handled within the sign out from account function call. With the sign into account, we now need to pass in a payload. So essentially it will have its initial state and then the action that we need to pass in, and this action will have a type of payload action, and then the payload action will be the Firebase user that we have defined at the top here. We're passing in a payload action, and the type of the payload action is the Firebase user, which is this object that we see here on the right of the console. So now all we need to do is again copy this and amend the state.user, which is equal to the action.payload, like so. So now if I save, that is now working correctly. The final thing is in our user reducer is this bottom piece of code here. Other code such as selectors can use the imported root state type. So we need to import this correctly. So if I delete this one, and then it's going to be import type from root state from the index file, which is this one over here. So now in my user reducer here, instead of state.counter.value now, it will be state.the name of the slice. So in this case, the slice name is user. So if I copy that, and we want to get access to its user value, so that is here. So it will be state.user.user again. And I'm just going to rename this from select count to select user. So essentially, when we when we call select user, what will happen is we get access to the state of the user at that moment in time, whether they are logged in or logged out. And one final amendment to make is, instead of the type, I'm just going to do import root state from index like so. And then finally, I just want to export the default of the user slice now. So now, as you can see, that is our user reducer now set up. If we go back into the documentation here, we have set up the user slice now. So when we go sign into account, we pass in the action payload. So we pass that in and then it dispatches and updates the user. If we click sign out from account, it sets the user to null as it was previously. We can then call these actions in our components. We can also have access to the user. If there is a user, then we call in the select user helper here. And then we are also exporting the user slice over here. In our index, we are configuring our store. So the user is equal to the user reducer, which is passed in our reducer. We are also exporting types. So the root state and app dispatch are being used in the user reducer and also in our index.ts hooks. As you can see here, we are further enhancing the use selector and use dispatch hook and adding our types in here like so. If we scroll down further on the documentation, it says use typed hooks in components. So now instead of calling use dispatch and use selector, we can now import use app selector and use app dispatch, which we are exporting over here. The final thing we need to do is we need to wrap this into a provider. So if we go to the app.tsx, which is the global level of our application, and what I'm going to do is around the theme provider, I'm going to wrap a provider from React Redux, and the store is going to be equal to the store. So we need to import this store from lib/store, and then it's going to be this index file here that we are exporting this store over here. So now going back in my app.tsx, I now need to close this provider off. So /provider like so. And now if I save all, we should now have a global wrapper around our application with React and Redux Toolkit. So in here, in our code now, what I'm going to do is go onto our Redux store over here. And now if I refresh the page, if I click onto this and we go onto the state, we now have a user state, which is equal to null. So that is working correctly. So when we now log into the application, we want to dispatch an action to our store to say that this time we have logged in and authenticated with Firebase. As you can see here, we just need to pass in the logged in credentials, which are the ones when we log in, into our store. So if we do that functionality now on the login page, so if we close the store down and the lib folder down, I want to go into my login form, and where we see the user credential here, I want to dispatch an action first of all. So dispatch, and we need to define what dispatch is now. So if we go up to the top under router, I'm going to name const dispatch. And normally you would do use dispatch, but what I'm going to do is do use app dispatch, which is from our hooks folder. So this is where the store of hooks comes into play. So now we have a use dispatch that is using the TypeScript types that we are using in our lib folder. So lib store hooks, and we are using this one over here. So now going back into my login form, we have access to the dispatch function here. And now what I also want to do is dispatch the action. So it will be, normally it's the type and then the payload, but in our store now, we have configured actions. So the action that I want to use is in my user reducer of sign into account. So we are exporting the sign into account here, and it takes in an action. So we will pass that in. So if I go back into my login form in here, I'm going to paste in my sign in to account action here, as you can see, and we now need to pass in the user credential.user. So if I tab that and now save, and all I need to do now is do the same for the login. So when we log in, we want to dispatch the action of sign into account, passing in the user credential.user, and then we want to navigate to the home page. And we need to test this out now. So what I'm going to do is go into /login. So in here, we have our initial state of null. I'm going to pass in some details. So test@test.com. And then the password is going to be Imran codes. Now, if I click sign in, we have an error. The user of test@test.com is not registered in our authentication. So let's just double check that. So at the minute, we only have 2 users. If I click create your Amazon account, what has happened is we have created a new user in our Firebase authentication. And then also 2, we have dispatched an action to our global store in Redux saying that the user has now signed in. So if I click onto here and expand this out, as you can see now, the state.user.user has a user object coming from Firebase in here. So now we can access this piece of state across our application. So what I'm going to do now is we have access to the email. So if we go into the header component, which is what we created earlier on, and where it says sign in, instead of sign in now, I'm going to get access to the state of the user. So in my header, if I press enter, I'm going to say const user is equal to, and this time instead of use app dispatch, I'm going to use app selector. So use selector from our hooks, and the selector I want to use is, we could normally pass in the state and have a callback of state.user.user, but because we have already defined the select helper, we could just call select user in here like so. And now if I say console log the user in my header component and save, if I go in my console now, you can see here that this user is being called, so I have access to this user. So in my top line over here, instead of hello now, I could do hello and then the user, and I want to optional change .email, and let's see if that showed up. So as you can see here, it says hello test@test.com, which is this email showing over here. And also if the user is signed in, so if the user is not equal to null, so initially the user is null, which is the correct functionality. If user is not equal to null, then we want to say sign out. Otherwise, we want to say sign in. And if we close this off, so this is just a bit of JavaScript saying if the user is not equal to null, then we can show sign out. Otherwise, we can show sign in. One final thing to do is if I click sign out, I want to then sign out of the Amazon application and log out of the authentication. So we can do that. So on the bottom line, I want to do an on click, which is equal to a function which we will create above. So handle sign in, this will be called. So we need to create this function now. So just going back up to the top, and we can delete this console log also. I'm going to create an arrow function. So const handle sign in. And what we want to do is check for the user first of all. So if user is not equal to null, so we want to do auth.signout. So this means that this will sign out the user from the application. We need to import the auth from our Firebase config. So control space /lib/Firebase, like so. We also want to dispatch as well. And because we're logging out, we want to import this. So, and const dispatch is equal to use app dispatch like so. And then we want to dispatch the sign out from account this time. So if I go into my reducer of user reducer, pass in the sign out from account. So this will set the state.user to null. So going back in here into my application, in my header, in my dispatch, I'm going to pass in sign out from account. So control space, and that is working correctly. And then if the user is equal to null, what we want to do is do an else block in here. And then we want to do router.push to the /login page. So all we need to do is const router is equal to use router, and then import this from next/router. So now if I save and refresh this, so essentially we are signed in now. If we sign out and we click here, this then dispatches an action. So if we see Redux, so if we refresh the page and click sign in, we now need to sign in. If I click sign in, and then as you can see, it says sign into account, the action has been dispatched. So we now have access to the user details here, and we also have access to the user details in the header. If I now click sign out, nothing is working. So what we need to do is invoke this sign out from account. So it actually works, and now save. And now if I click sign out, as you can see, that has changed in the header, and sign out from account has set the user to null again. So now that is the Redux store setup and the authentication setup. What we will do next is create the homepage. As you can see here, we have products. So we will introduce GraphQL into our application and also GraphCMS, where we will fetch the relevant product data from.